This is why you never hear me talking about just kids, but the families. What can we do to strengthen them? You and I have been talking about addictions and all kinds of things that we know happen when stresses are there because they can't afford the rent, they can't get the job, or whatever it is that makes them feel incomplete. And then they're filling it with things that aren't healthy. And then the child ends up having their own experiences that are not positive, but still the love piece, the wish for the best piece, never goes away, ever.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Representative Alyse Galvin, who currently represents Midtown Anchorage in the Alaska State House. She is known, however, for her two runs for the U.S. House in 2018 and 2020 against long-term Congressman Don Young. With 46.5% of the vote, she got closer to defeating him than any other opponent in his 49 years in office. A third-generation Alaskan, Alyse had a childhood with significant challenges. Challenges that for some of us seem unbelievably hard, but unfortunately, for too many in Alaska, are all too familiar. We talk about how those challenges inspire her indefatigable work to strengthen families and improve our education system.
Alyse Galvin, welcome to the podcast.
Why, thank you very much, Andrew Gray. Pleasure to be here.
We were just talking about what we were going to talk about, and you said we might want to include this, and so I started recording.
Let's go there. I think it's important that folks understand that some people are not comfortable digging in deep to their personal life story, and there are two reasons for that. I think one is that it's personal, and they have to relive it when they do it. I've kind of gotten over that, to be honest. As you know, that was part of running for office. But the other part, and in fact, it inspired me, right? It was the personal story that was the reason I was there. And the other part that's important that we note, though, is that I am very well aware that a personal story that sometimes can be deep and dark scares people. It makes them think differently of you. It makes them think that you must not be normal. And I've lived that my whole life, almost, right? Because we all go to school and they know that there's something odd happening at your house or whatever. And so I've learned throughout my life to not only mask that, but to find ways that people could see that, look, I'm okay. You don't have to worry about me. Our relationship can be normal. And so I just wanted to flag that for you because I thought you may want to dig in deep to it.
I think one thing I've learned, and I mean, I'm not a great interviewer, and I'm not, I haven't been doing this very long, but this podcast episode will be 30 or 40 minutes long. Yeah. It's 30 or 40 minutes of what we talked about that day at that time.
Right.
And it is not a person's life story. And I would be so, I know, like, I've interviewed Dan O'Neill, an author in Fairbanks, who's an oral historian, and he used to record thousands of hours of interviews. And I was like, thousands of hours? Like, what are you talking about? Like, what could possibly be there? But the truth is that we all tell our story a different way at different times. And this is just one of them. It's a tiny facet. It's
absolutely. And that's why I'm here, right? Clearly I'm willing, but you and I have joked about, when are you going to get in there? And I'm like, nobody wants to hear about my story. And you're like, why not? Come on. And I just think it's important that you know that a little bit of the maybe tension behind that or context is that I and now you're reassuring me that, look, we're not going to go anyplace, and I get that, but I've heard some of your podcasts, and it's important that sometimes the darker part comes out, and that's okay, but that has been one of the reasons that I maybe have been a little bit hesitant is that I don't want to scare people. And, when I have, when people don't hear the whole thing, sometimes they extrapolate their own version, and then they either are concerned or maybe they think that anyone who has experienced things like that isn't competent. And I know that's not true. I know, and I'm sure you do too, having worked with so many people, that anyone who's experienced trauma are in different places. Sometimes they can work with it and sometimes they can't. Well, I've been extraordinarily lucky in life. And people are like, what are you talking about? Well, no matter what, I have always known, one is I've had my faith that's been intact. And secondly, I've known that there is a bigger circle in my life of people who are always going to be there and lift me. But there have been a lot of times when people weren't there. And always a child should have adults that you can count on. And that just hasn't always been the case when I was very young. But like I said, I'm extraordinarily lucky. I've been through all of that. And now, and managed to make my school environment, my family, my home. I'm so lucky.
Well, and I think we were just talking about this actually, about Alaska and Alaska's being number one in lots of categories that we don't want to be number one in. But I think there's a lot of trauma in Alaska. Yeah. A lot of Alaskans who've experienced a lot of trauma. And I think that...
And then the system hasn't served them well after that, which kind of compiled onto their trauma. That's the difference. For me, I managed to, at a time when they were ready to send me off and into the system, so to speak, when it really wasn't very strong, I was scooped up by, relatives, extended relatives who then took me in, and maybe they sent me off to another family or to a boarding school or whatever, but it helped. It was the difference for me. And then I had the educators who lifted me. So, but it's true in Alaska, and we've talked about this, whether it's alcoholism or drugs or other things that has led to a real weakening of families. And I certainly was in that bucket.
Well, let's talk about whatever you're comfortable with. So your parents both grew up in Anchorage?
Okay. Yeah. So no, my mom grew up in Anchorage. She came up, I think she was 3 years old when she came up. My grandmother was up and then went south and then came back. And so she was here all her early years, and then went to West High and graduated from there. And then she was going to go to some sort of schooling that involved accounting. So she went south to Riverside, California, and got pregnant. So
she met your dad there?
Met my dad there, who was an auto mechanic. And so they had me. We came up. I was 3 months old when I came up. And then my dad was an auto mechanic here right on the Park Strip as well. And then he ended up owning a Texaco in Government Hill. And that's kind of where we landed. And then my dad worked on the slope in the 70s. And then things a little bit imploded because, I think this is common for Alaskan families, there was a lot of drinking. When the money came in with the slope, drinking, drugs, I think it was hard on families. For some, it was, of course, amazing. And it was...
Because money came in as well.
Money came in. It was great. Now we're building things here in town. Everything was fantastic in that way. But I think if you have a propensity to be addicted, and it turns out both my parents did, it was a hard time. So... I had two siblings, so with me on Government Hill, and fortunately there was extended family around, and eventually, got.
So do you? when you think about your childhood, your early childhood, I mean, is it always that there's a lot of drinking in the house? Or, I mean, do you remember when it started, or is it just...
Well, I don't know if you know kids' minds. Like, they think of things, all the good stuff. I remember, having so much fun fishing and in little mini bikes. And we had a lot of great Alaskan times. But I do also remember that as the day grew long, as the nighttime came, kind of feeling unsure and never knew what to expect. And typically by then, my folks were...
Both of them.
Both of them. Yeah. And in our case, my dad grew violent. I know that's not always the case. Like with some, they grow calm or
like he's
sleepy, but he was one of those.
Like a funny drunk or a...
Yeah, right. They're different
a nice
kinds.
drunk. Or...
Yeah, I would say my mom was a nice drunk. And so anyway, that was, that made it tougher, as a kiddo to negotiate. But I think mostly, I think of that time as, almost like survival.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, you were the oldest.
No, I was the youngest of three, but I was the one I was the girl, and I don't mean to sound sexist, but it is true that I was the one who found the 27 cents so that we could buy a can of chili. And I was the one who made the dinner and, different things like that.
So I had thought like that your mom, when she moved to Riverside, she had 3 kids in Riverside and then moved up when you were 3 months old. Or...
It's complicated. Okay. It went back and forth. Each kid, she ended up trying to come back, and then we're going to go back to school, and then it didn't quite work out. So yeah, it was not as linear as... So
you were the youngest, but you were also, you said, sort of the problem solver, like trying to figure out how, trying to take care of your older brothers.
Yeah, very much so. And they were, I mean, like I said, that we remember some good times. We all played hockey. And I remember when we would go and watch my dad. In fact, he was a Wolverine. I know now they have a Wolverines here in town. And he was a Wolverine at the Arctic. Right now, it's Arctic Office Supply. That used to be a giant arena. And I remember going there, and it was a little bit of a drinking scene back when Olympia beer was big. And I would... And other kids did this too, but we would be beneath the stands collecting money. And we would go and look for money, and then I'd have a pocket full of money so that I was prepared in part, but also because it was sort of a fun thing to do. Kids find ways to make whatever day or night is happening.
Well, you mentioned that you had to find the 27 cents for a can of chili because you didn't always have dinner or like...
they just weren't present, right? If they were out or knocked out or passed out, then they weren't present. And so we had to figure things out. There were times when it just got pretty messy, and
Was it something that you tried to keep secret, or was this something that
Oh, very much. We didn't want any other family members to know. We all somehow had this... And I think this may still go on now, this belief that if somebody finds out, we'll all get taken apart. And in fact, that is what happened, right? We ended up splitting up. Originally, the 3 of us, I want to say, we went down to my grandmother's in Arizona. And then we were sent to Colorado to an Alaskan family.
When you 3 got sent to your grandmother in Arizona, I mean, obviously your grandmother knew what was happening.
That's right, because somehow word got out, and so she sent my uncle over to pick us up, and we tried to hide. We went to a friend's house and hid.
Because you didn't want to leave Alaska.
No, oh my gosh, we couldn't even imagine. But we'd never even been out of Alaska. We didn't know a lot other than it's important that we stay together. So that was an interesting time. I do remember. Thinking that we almost missed the red-eye flight. And somehow to me, in my brain at that time...
If you missed the flight, you wouldn't have to go.
Yep. And none of this would have ever happened. But we ended up in Arizona. And actually, again, I was fortunate.
How old?
I was at the time 10, I think. And my Yeah. And my grandmother didn't have the wherewithal at that time to take care of us, but she had the finances to send us away. So we went to a horse-based, very good school in Arizona. So we were able to do that.
Like a boarding school?
Mm-hmm.
All three of you together?
All three of us together at that one time. Then my older brother, he acted out a lot of frustration, as you could imagine. He would have been 13. And so he ended up getting kicked out of the
horse school.
Well, really by my grandmother, because she didn't want any bad reputation. And so he came back up here to be with my dad, and he was still working on the slope most of the time. So my brother really didn't get much attention at all.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, were you in contact with your parents when you went to Arizona?
Well, I think like many kids, when the parents have problems, I was not. I tried to. I wrote letters all the time. I found out later that my grandmother didn't send them. And my dad had written, and I found out later I never got them. In fact, what was really neat was that so we ended up going to Colorado for 1 year after the boarding school. I lived with an Alaskan family there who decided they'd take us in. Then the next year they said, we only want one. And I wasn't the chosen one. But I was really a good test taker. So I ended up going to another boarding school in San Diego. So I was there in San Diego again. That became my family. I was so lucky that there were teachers there who just scooped me right up. So when there was a parent weekend, they would make sure I wasn't alone, all of that. But at that time, since you're asking about letters and contacting, remember the days of putting in a dime and calling collect? So I would try that. Never could really reach anyone in Alaska other than my aunt and uncle, who became very instrumental in my life as well. In some ways, they got us back up here. But I would write to my dad and my mom. And I never knew if they got the letters. My mom she was in and out of care centers, I want to say, for all of those years. So maybe 10 years in and out of rehab. And I say in and out, meaning I even stayed with her for a few months at a time, but then she tried to commit suicide, not once, twice, but 3 times, and each time back into a rehab. So, I sort of had the consistency of the boarding school. Anyway, I always got a birthday card from my mom. So there was always, I knew I was loved. It was that piece that I really appreciated. She always sent $2 in it and, let me know that I loved her. I didn't get that from my dad. But.
And you didn't get the letters from your dad that he had, right?
That he had received any. So what was interesting is that from boarding school, I sent letters up to my dad. And they were, I looked at them later and they were so cheesy. I even typewrote one on a typewriter. And when he passed away, he drowned when he was 58 in Big Lake. We went through his things and we found sort of like a scrapbook. And I want to say at least 10 pages of it were glued in my letters. And that was all the affirmation I needed. That was huge to me. And I knew, of course, by that point that he had appreciated me. There were other times when we brought him in by that point because he needed some medical care for different things. But he was such a character Alaskan. His transportation was his horse out in Big Lake. I mean, you can imagine. He was a mechanic, so he was able to help a lot of people, fixing a lot of things. Everything was DIY up there. I'm telling you, it's DIY, do it yourself, because that's really that mentality, just like it is today. And so he was a very well loved character in Big Lake. And so going to his funeral and seeing these scrapbooks were a way for me to know that even though I didn't have it on the receiving end at that time, later I knew it was there. And you know what? Kids always believe it's there. Mm. We have this way of having hope that I think is so important. It really drives me to why I'm sitting here today with you, Andrew, is that I want to keep that hope for as many people as we can in whatever way we can do it.
So you're third generation Alaskan. Grandparents, or I guess maybe your granddad came up for World War II?
Right. So it was a great uncle, two great uncles that came up, and they were serving in World War II. And my great aunt was a teacher in Nebraska. And so they wrote letters back and forth. At that time, you weren't allowed to tell where you were serving in World War II. That was a big no-no. And so they had code in their letters that helped them to know where he was. And there was something about the rugged spirit of my grandmother and her two sisters. What happened was then the one sister came up first in 1941, and then my grandmother and the next sister came. So there's something exciting about that. Of course, they didn't know what they were getting into, but they knew that they wanted to be together, and so they came up. And my grandmother lived in a chicken coop for a little while, no water, the whole works, and they lived that Alaskan life. So yes, so it was Delaney Park Strip was near where that chicken coop was at the time. I think the other aunt might have lived in a Quonset hut. Does that sound right? Mm-hmm. And then eventually, my aunt was a teacher and there's still, the schoolhouse is still there on, I think it's 3rd Street. It's the old Anchorage schoolhouse, and she taught there. She was the Republican Women's Club president, I think. I don't know if maybe it wasn't called Republican, maybe it was just the Women's Club. But they produced recipe books at the time, and I have one of those. So it's so exciting to have that little piece of history. There's kind of a lot of history in my family for Alaska, and my of course not nearly as much as if I were Indigenous, but it's exciting that it was pre-statehood. And then my grandfather came up. He was originally from Indianapolis, and then he worked in Seattle. And he came up with the bank working for First National. And that's how he met my grandmother, who was also working as a cashier. And I think he was something else. And as soon as they fell in love, he fired her. That's sort of the story goes, because then in those days you weren't allowed to date or marry your coworker. Not allowed.
I have a not romantic story about my grandparents where my grandfather met my grandmother as a waitress. Mm-hmm. And when they started dating, he stopped tipping her.
Not so good. That is not cool.
Because he didn't need to anymore.
Okay, well, when Pat and I came up to Alaska, and I think it must have been 1987, we had just started dating. We met at UCSD, and I said, well, I need to head home. I need to get back to Alaska. I'm taking my Ford Tempo and driving up. If you want to come, you can. We'd been together, I think, 3 months. And so he said, oh, yeah, I want to go. So we camped all the way up, and then we ended up at the slime line first. We worked at a fisheries, and then...
It's the mid-'80s.
Mid-'80s, 87. And we were, I think it was called Whitney's Food near the airport. And then we got jobs at Simon and Seaford's. And since you mentioned waitressing, I was waitressing. He was a busser. And the story always goes that I flipped him a quarter now and then, because he was so upset with how the servers did not tip out enough. And of course, I was always very careful to be fair about that, because they did all the brunt of the work, the heavy carrying, so to speak. So, yeah, I can appreciate that story of yours with your grandparents.
You met your husband.
Right there at UCSD. And he was a film and quantitative decision-making degree. he had moved from EECS, which is engineering, to this, which I think it just kind of helped to feed his artistic side and his math brain. And he ended up then going from there to, well, I don't know if I want to go to a master's school in art or should I do law school? And so he just decided to take the tests, and whichever one he got him the most scholarship he went to. And by then, as you know, we got married after I graduated, and I was pregnant. And so we decided he's the guy who's tests unbelievably well. And so we'll let him go to school first. Mm-hmm. So that's what happened. Was he did school, I did a home business, and then
in Anchorage.
No, so we got to Anchorage. So he was doing the schooling down there. He went to law school and MBA.
Oh, okay.
During that time in San Diego, I was running a home business that was selling a thermal binding system. Oh. Yeah, before that, I'd worked 4 years at the hospital right adjacent to the university. Mm-hmm. I was on track to do something in policy with healthcare, really interested in all that, but it didn't pay. Mm-hmm. And then a buddy came by and
you were pregnant. And your son's in school.
Yeah, a lot of stuff went on.
Your husband.
Yeah, so he was like, look at this machine. And I'm like, that is amazing. It was something that out of Belgium. And so I was able to run that business and do very well, enough to help pay the bills. And then I was pregnant with the second one. And I said to Pat, I cannot stay here another minute, because, again, going back to the difference between San Diego and Alaska, San Diego did not have dirt to play in, right? It's almost all covered with concrete. Beautiful, clean. I love visiting there. You have to get from one place to another, you need to be in a car for 25 minutes, and it's torture for a kid. As a mom who's noticing these things, I just didn't want to live it. So anyway, what the story Pat will tell is that I rigged the system. We did have this really lovely talk where we opened a book about best places to live, and we each wrote a list. We were very fair, all the way to the point where we had this list of North Carolina, Minneapolis, different places, and at the bottom, and we compared it to a book that said, well, if you look at Anchorage healthcare system, they're this number, education system, this number for the different places. And then I was the one who sent out the resumes to different places. And I may have first sent them to, Anchorage, Alaska, the A, maybe I was doing it alphabetically. And so he may have received more offers from Alaska. And then my great aunt and great uncle, very special to me. My uncle just passed away a couple years ago at 99.
Wow.
He served in World War II here in Alaska. Another one who you should have had a podcast with, because it's much more interesting story. But anyway, we did then. They sent us tickets. Come on up and have a look. And so we came up, and at that time, then we had some interviews scheduled, and Pat then agreed with me that this is the most amazing place on earth. And even though the first year was the worst winter Alaska's ever seen, he managed to keep a smile on his face and do a lot of shoveling, and it was just great.
Well, there's so much I want to talk about, but we have a time crunch.
Yes, we do.
And I want to talk about running for Congress. That is what most people know you for.
Right.
And so I guess if you could fill us in the experience that kind of led up to jumping off that ledge.
Well, I'm a mom, and I have 4 kids. And I was very actively involved in their school. I did work as well, various years, but I was especially attentive to watching what was going on within their school system. So I saw the opportunities for my firstborn were pretty great. And then my fourth child had a very different experience. They didn't have art in their school. He didn't have, a bunch of different things that a counselor, things that really mattered. So,
and they were like 10 years apart?
Yeah. 10 years
so you
apart.
were able to see what happened in Anchorage schools.
Absolutely. And remember,
from the oil boom.
As it was kind of, changing. And remember too, I spent time as a volunteer in the school. So I'm there day to day watching what that classroom experience is like for the students as the classrooms sizes grew. And so I got very involved in advocating for investing in our schools, investing in our children, essentially. So I helped to grow a group called Great Alaska Schools. So now I'm learning more about who's making the decisions, how they're making them, all of that. And it became clear to me that we need to make sure that from the school board level all the way up, really are putting our public education first. And so I really worked on getting other people to run for office first. I went to something called Great Alaska Schools. It was called Alaska Women Ascend. And that was run by some really wonderful women leaders who had in the past served in a nonpartisan group, fairly progressive, and they certainly cared about education. And so there I learned and met all the other women who cared about similar things. So I then started having lunches with these women saying, hey, if you run, I will help you win. Unfortunately, I didn't have any luck getting anyone to run. But one year, Dina and I agreed to both run on different strands. So Dina Mitchell is a good friend who is part of this Great Alaska Schools work. She ran for school board. I ran for Congress. My seat in my district was being served well. And as I looked up the ladder of where we need to make changes, I saw that our U.S. congressperson, I felt at the time, and I still feel, wasn't putting education first. And so that's just where I am. And as most voters know, that's where I'll always be, is making sure that our kids get that chance of a good, solid ground footing.
So I get it. You are looking at where is the place where the biggest change needs to happen in terms of putting education first. And you say, well, it's the U.S. Congress. Well, I mean, I'm just saying, I'm wondering if you can tell the story of like the first person you told that to. What was that conversation like? Was it Pat? Was it your husband?
No. Someone asked me. What happened was I went in and I'm like, hey, well, I said, I'm worried people are dropping out of Alaska Women Ascend, particularly people of color. I'm not having any luck getting anyone to run for anything. I'm here because I want to change the system. And that person said to me, you need to run for Congress. We need someone to run for Congress. You are the one to do it. We know you have the grit. We know you have the capability to really drive this home. And I just looked at her like she was crazy. And I said, well, let me consider that. That was not the first thing on my mind. A lot of people are surprised by that, but I had no idea. So I later was told that I was asked to run many times for my House and Senate position, but I didn't ever
you didn't hear it.
Never even heard it. Not once. So I went home and yes, the first thing I did was ask Pat. And Pat said, well, I can't imagine any reason why you shouldn't run. In fact, it's time for our family to focus on you doing what you want to do to grow not only your career, but to make the changes that you've been wanting to make. And this seems like the right thing. So then we put the kids on the phone. Same thing. We had that same conversation. And I was surprised that they were so supportive. They said, well, they couldn't imagine anyone else doing such a good job. We're in. And so there it began.
So it's 2018. You haven't run. I mean, that's your first time running for office. I mean, since high school. You've done Alaska Women Ascend. I mean, I just have to put it in my own perspective. Like, I ran for a state house seat and I didn't know what I was doing, and it was really hard, and I thought it was going to kill me. I can't even imagine running for.
Well, first, let's give credit to Alaska Women Ascend, who had spent time helping us to imagine what any race would be like on any level. And let's also remember that I have now learned that school board doesn't really impact how much money goes into the system. They have to take whatever money's given to them, right? From feds and from the state, mostly. And then they get to channel that. So in my head, I'm driven, right? I'm driven for all the schools in all of the state. I've now, we didn't cover this, but I've worked for the State Department of Education. So I've been able to travel to many rural communities, seeing how big of a difference losing one staffer makes for a school of 200, for example. And I mean, this is so real to me. So how could I do it? Because I was so driven for the kids. I mean, it was, and how did I bring together such a team? Well, a little bit of it was luck, but most of it was that I found people who believed in the same sorts of things that I did. I had an all women initially at the beginning of the campaign, a lot of people who had been through Alaska Women Ascend, and people who believed in, understood my drive, understood why I was doing it, and agreed and wanted the same thing for Alaska's future. So that's how I did it, is I found the people who were driven, and they're smart, right? They're smart women, know what they're doing. We had a little bit of a recipe, so now we're going to follow it. And I know that that is sort of something that people can't get their heads wrapped around, but it is really that simple for me. It was start with your drive and let that drive you all along the road.
And I mean, 47% of the vote, you did better than anyone who ran against that particular congressman.
Yeah. It will, and that goes to show that it does take money to win races, number one. And maybe that there is some validity in growing a big team. I think that, and who can express to other voters what I'm running for. And the more we can get that out from person to person, but then also sometimes you have to use media, and that's the money piece. Do you have a particular,
deep memory, like one that's etched in your head forever from the experience of running twice for statewide office?
That's a tough question. I think of my trauma experience, right? Which was, of course, the handshake where I had a bruise for the next 2.5 weeks.
Because and everybody it so hard.
And everybody talked about how I'm, such a weak person or whatever. But so that was a traumatic experience.
Well, I guess but I think for listeners who may not know what happened.
Oh,
it was a debate.
So there was a debate, and it went really well for me. And I think he was upset. And I think his adrenaline worked up, I'm guessing. But after the debate, I went to shake his hand, and he went to shake mine, and he grinded. I mean, it was like he was
trying to break the bones.
Yeah. And it did have a horrible effect. I couldn't wear rings for, like 4 weeks or something, just because of the bad swelling. And I didn't go and have it x-rayed or anything. I mean, by then somebody had picked it up and went crazy because I said, stop that. Right. I can't believe I had the wherewithal to actually say something, because sometimes when you're getting in the moment of a hurtful experience, you forget to say something and you freeze. I'm proud that I said that. I'm like, stop that. That hurts. And he's like, so anyway, that was one experience that I remember. But I think I'm going to share another one that's a little bit more positive, that just makes me smile. And that is, we had all kinds of events that were unusual. Everything from in the 49th State Brewery being completely packed, but starting with a chaplain in prayer. I mean, it was a beautiful experience. Lots of those really neat things too. The one that comes to mind is being in Palmer in a farm field, running a rally, and every car. So the field was full of cars, and the cars had tuned their radio to the sound system because it was COVID times.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, well, we're going to do things. Doesn't matter if it's COVID times. We're going to find a way. If people are safe in their car, then let's do a car thing. And then I had a great dynamic team who's like, okay, I guess so. And they went with it. And they then found the way to tune radios like we did in the olden days with drive-in movies, right? So we had this, and it was a beautiful day. If you've been to Palmer Fair, you know how pretty it can be out there. The backdrop was mountains. It was just so beautiful. And in all of these events, I try to have live music. So live music to start with the Star Spangled Banner or the Alaska song, things like that, the flag song. And so that moment, and then when it ended, sometimes people are comfortable getting out of their car and coming up. And this time there was a family and a young girl. Maybe she was 8 years old. She came up and she said hi, and I said hi, and we hugged and did our thing. And she told me what she cared about, which of course is, in this case, it was teachers and horses. Like, great. And then she just loved school. And then she ran away, and her mom said, hey, I want you to know you've had such an impact on my daughter. She's never, ever thought about politics. And now she's telling me she wants to run for her class. Well, I don't know what it was, class president or whatever. But that came up so many times. But this is one that I remember because the mom was in tears, and it was just so special. It was such an honor to be able to run and meet I cannot tell you how many people sent me letters about how much they care about the state, sent me things like a hand knit scarf that they had dyed the fox wool and Arctic. I mean, the people they care so deeply about the state that when they find out somebody might represent who they align with, they just went all in. And I still have friends all over the state who I intend to keep in touch with in some way. Not that I intend to run for office, but it sticks with me. It really does.
So
really good times.
And I'm just speaking for me. One of the things that's been hard for me, my dad died a few years ago. And before I'd ever been interested in politics, and and then I ran for office, and
sorry.
And I just wonder about because so much of me was like wanting to make my parents proud, and did you feel like? Do you think about what your parents would think?
There are times when I have to, of course. And then I'm also reminded, my uncle, who I mentioned, one of his last conversations with me was, don't stop. And he had seen me not win twice, and he still didn't want me to stop. And it was so precious. He just you've got the energy and you care more than anyone I know. In his own words, he said things like that. And then there was another time when I called my dad's ex-wife. So this would have been after my mom. She lives in Big Lake still. And we haven't been in close contact, but I did tell her I was running, and she said something to the effect of, well, Alyse, I've been wanting to tell you something for a while. Your dad would be so proud. And I believe he would be. If he had it within him, he would be so proud. So we've been given these deep gifts from when we were young of all kinds of mixed experiences. But when push comes to shove, there's nothing like a parent's love for a child. That never goes away. They may have their own problems. And I was recently talking to another legislator about this who has adopted a child. And she shared with me that separation from her, of the adopted child from their parents has had such a great impact. And I think it does on everyone. This is why you never hear me talking about just kids, but the families. What can we do to strengthen them? You and I have been talking about addictions and all kinds of things that we know happen when stresses are there because they can't afford the rent, they can't get the job, or whatever it is that makes them feel incomplete. And then they're filling it with things that aren't healthy. And then the child ends up having their own experiences that are not positive, but still the love piece, the wish for the best piece, never goes away, ever. I feel that. So I feel proud, and I think that my parents would be very proud too.
Well, Alyse Galvin, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
You bet. Thanks, Andrew.
Big thank you to Maya Narang for making this podcast listenable, and thank you to you, our listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email eastanchoragebbookclub@gmail.com. That's eastanchoragebbookclub, all one word, @gmail.com.